It was a quiet Saturday morning at the lake community. The kind of morning where the sunlight hits the water just right and the birds sound like they have nowhere else to be. I was in the backyard sipping coffee when I heard a faint metallic clink coming from the driveway. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the garden tools. But then came another sound, a sharper one, the sound of metal sliding into a keyhole. I froze and leaned forward, listening carefully. It was coming from the garage. I set my cup down and walked slowly toward the front of the house. Through the corner of the window, I saw her.
Karen.
Every neighborhood has one. Ours had the Karen, the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association. She stood by my garage door holding a shiny keyring in her hand, her face full of focus and confidence, like she was performing a noble duty. She muttered to herself as she tried one key after another. "Let's see if this one works. Maybe he changed the lock again," she said in that sharp tone that always carried across the whole street. My security cameras caught everything. The motion alert blinked on my phone. I had installed a new system last month, one that allowed two-way audio. So I opened the app, leaned back against the wall, and waited. She jiggled another key into the lock. It didn't fit, but she kept twisting anyway. I could almost hear the metal grinding. Finally, I pressed the talk button on the camera and spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. "Looking for something, Karen?" She froze. The keys slipped from her hand and clattered onto the driveway. Her eyes darted around until she spotted the small black camera above the garage light. Her face drained of color faster than I'd ever seen before. "Oh, I was just checking to make sure your garage door was locked," she stammered, trying to compose herself. "You know, HOA safety check and all." "Karen, there is no HOA safety check," I replied. "And there's definitely no reason for you to have keys to my property." She blinked rapidly, her voice shaking a little. "Oh, well, I have the master key. You know, the one the board uses for emergencies." "Karen, we don't have a master key." "No one does." She swallowed hard and tried to smile, but her hands trembled as she bent to pick up her keys. I could see the embarrassment burning through her. Meanwhile, a few of the neighbors had peeked out from their windows. It was hard not to watch when Karen was involved in anything. I kept my voice steady, but lower this time. "You might want to explain to the police why you're trying to open my garage on camera." Her eyes widened. "Police?" she said, her tone breaking slightly. "That won't be necessary. I was just trying to help." I didn't answer. I just let the silence sit there. The camera light blinked red every few seconds, recording everything. She turned in a small circle, as if searching for a way out. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The confidence she carried everywhere had vanished. Finally, she mumbled something about having another meeting to attend and hurried down the driveway. Her steps uneven, her face pale, as the clouds rolling over the lake. I watched her go, then looked at my phone again. The footage had already saved to the cloud. I smiled quietly to myself, because for the first time ever, Karen wasn't the one watching everyone else. She was the one being watched. Karen walked quickly down the street, clutching her keys, so tight they jingled in her hand. Her shoulders were stiff, her pace uneven, as if every step carried the weight of embarrassment. I watched from the camera feed as she turned the corner, glancing back twice to see if anyone was still watching. But by then, a few neighbors had already stepped out, pretending to check their mail or water plants. They saw everything. Mrs. Turner from next door waved at me when she noticed my front window. Her expression said everything without a single word. Everyone had grown tired of Karen and her endless crusade of control. I walked out to the driveway to pick up the key she had dropped. It was silver with a little tag that said HOA Master. I shook my head slowly, turning it over in my hand. The metal looked new, polished, as if it had just been cut recently. So she wasn't lying about it being made. Someone had gone through the trouble to create fake keys. That was serious. I slipped it into a small plastic bag and went back inside. The coffee had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I was too busy thinking about how far Karen was willing to go. The next morning, I decided to check the rest of my security footage. When I rewound the feed, I saw something that made me pause. Karen hadn't come alone. A few minutes before she tried the lock, another person had walked up the driveway. It was Mark from the HOA board. He had handed her the keys and whispered something before leaving quickly toward his car. So, it wasn't just Karen this time. They were planning something together. I leaned closer to the screen, my jaw tightening. If they thought they could push me around like some rookie homeowner, they were wrong. Later that afternoon, I saw Karen's car parked outside the HOA office. She was standing by the door talking to Mark, her hands moving fast as she explained something. I could tell she was nervous from the way she kept glancing around. I decided not to confront her yet. It was better to let her feel comfortable. People like Karen always revealed more when they thought they were in control. That night I sat on the porch, watching the calm reflection of the lake. The lights shimmered and the air carried a cool breeze. But I knew the peace wouldn't last long. Karen didn't like to lose. And after what happened that morning, she would be looking for a way to strike back. I could almost imagine her pacing in her kitchen, rehearsing excuses. She would probably claim she was misunderstood, that she was doing her duty as an HOA member. But I had the recording, every second of it. And if she wanted to turn this into a game, I was ready to play it better than she ever could. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. Karen's car stayed parked in her driveway, and she didn't make her usual morning rounds with her clipboard and coffee mug. It was strange, because Karen never went more than a few hours without inspecting someone's lawn or measuring a fence. I knew she was planning something. That kind of silence from her was never peace, it was strategy. On the fourth day, I was working in the yard when I noticed Mark walking down the street. He was wearing his usual polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. He waved, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, they're just checking in," he said. He stopped a few feet away, pretending to admire the flowers by the mailbox. "I heard there was some kind of misunderstanding between you and Karen." I looked at him carefully. "A misunderstanding?" I said. "She tried to open my garage with a key that wasn't hers." Mark shifted on his feet, avoiding eye contact. "Well, sometimes things get mixed up," he said quickly. "Karen just wanted to make sure everything was up to code. You know, the usual HOA procedure." I didn't answer. I just tilted my head slightly. He cleared his throat and added, "Maybe we can just forget about it. No harm done, right?" "No harm done," I repeated slowly. "You gave her that key, Mark?" His eyes widened just a bit. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice unsteady. I stepped closer, lowering my tone. "I have the footage, Mark, every second of it. You handing her the keys right before she tried to open my garage." For a moment his face went pale, the same shade Karen had turned when the camera spoke. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. I finally smiled and said, "You might want to tell Karen to stay off my property. Next time, I won't just talk through the camera." He nodded quickly, mumbling something about having another meeting, and walked off. I watched him go, knowing the message had landed. That night, my phone buzzed again. Another motion alert. I opened the live feed and saw a car parked across the street with its headlights off. I zoomed in. It was Karen's car. She sat behind the wheel staring at my house, her face half lit by the glow of her phone. She wasn't done. Not yet. I watched her for a long time as she just sat there. Every few minutes, she would glance at her phone, then at my driveway, like she was waiting for something or someone. I didn't move. I didn't go outside. I just let the red camera light blink in the dark, reminding her that I was watching too. Finally, after almost an hour, she started the engine and drove away slowly down the road, disappearing into the mist that hung over the lake. The sound of her car faded, but the unease stayed behind. Karen wasn't giving up, and I had the feeling this was only the beginning of whatever she was planning next. The following morning, the neighborhood felt heavier than usual. The air was still, and even the usual sound of kids playing by the lake was missing. Something about the quiet made me alert, like the calm before a storm. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and glanced down the street. Karen's car was gone, but her front curtains were open. Through the window, I could see her pacing back and forth, holding her phone tightly to her ear. Her movements were sharp, fast, restless. I could only imagine the kind of calls she was making. Probably trying to gather backup from the rest of the HOA board. People like her never acted alone for long. Later that afternoon, I went into town to run errands. When I returned, I found an envelope taped to my front door. It had the HOA logo on it and my name written in Karen's handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside was a printed notice claiming I had violated multiple community guidelines. It listed everything from paint color to lawn maintenance and even noise complaints. All of it false, every word. At the bottom was her signature bold and underlined. I almost laughed. It was her way of fighting back when she couldn't win face to face. But what she didn't realize was that this time she had crossed a line. I took a photo of the notice and attached it to the email thread I had already started with the property inspector. He had seen the footage too, and he wasn't impressed with Karen's behavior. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, I heard a car pull up outside. A white truck with county markings stopped in front of Karen's house. 2 inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand. I leaned against my porch rail and watched as they knocked on her door. Karen answered, wearing a forced smile. Her voice carried across the quiet street. She sounded nervous, trying to explain something. The inspectors didn't seem convinced. They pointed at her yard, her mailbox, the storage shed she had built last summer without permission. Her expression changed from polite to panicked. For once, she wasn't the one giving orders, she was the one scrambling to keep up. Mark came jogging up a few minutes later, trying to defuse the situation. He looked tense, sweating in the heat. The inspectors handed him a paper, then turned and walked toward their truck. Karen just stood there frozen, clutching the notice they had given her. I didn't need to know what it said. I could tell from her face that whatever was written, there wasn't good news. She turned slowly, and her eyes met mine across the street. For the first time, she didn't glare or scowl. She just looked defeated. I didn't smile. I simply nodded once and went back inside. The sound of the inspector's truck faded down the road, leaving only the hum of the cicadas in the distance. That night, I sat on the porch again, watching the soft ripples on the lake. It was calm, peaceful. But I knew Karen wouldn't disappear completely. People like her always came back when they thought the dust had settled. And I had a feeling she was already planning her next move in that house filled with notes, lists, and control. The next morning, the sun rose behind a thin layer of fog that floated over the lake. Everything looked quiet, but I could feel tension hiding beneath the calm surface. Karen's blinds were still closed, and that was unusual. She always opened them early to watch everyone like a hawk. I walked to the mailbox and found another envelope waiting for me. But this one wasn't from the HOA. It was official, with a county seal stamped on the front. I opened it and read the first few lines slowly. It was a notice confirming that the inspector had opened a formal review of the HOA board. The letter mentioned multiple complaints from residents and possible misuse of authority. A quiet smile spread across my face. Karen had finally pushed too far, and now the county was paying attention. By noon, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. People stood in small groups, talking by their mailboxes and driveways. Everyone had heard what happened. Some of them even came over to ask if it was true that Karen had been caught trying to enter my garage. I didn't exaggerate, I just told them the truth. They shook their heads, some in disbelief, others trying not to laugh. It was strange seeing people who once feared Karen now talking freely, without worry. Around sunset, I noticed movement near her house. Karen stepped outside with Mark. They were standing near the curb, whispering. Her face looked pale and tense while Mark kept rubbing the back of his neck like a man under pressure. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could read their body language. They were planning something again. Karen pointed toward my house, her hand slicing through the air sharply. Mark nodded, though he didn't look eager to agree. A few minutes later, they both went back inside, but the uneasy feeling stayed. I knew better than to think she would quit. Karen wasn't the type to let embarrassment stop her. She would try to regain control no matter what it took. That night, I checked my camera feeds again. The footage showed nothing strange until almost midnight. Then a shadow appeared near the side of my house. Someone was moving slowly along the fence line. I zoomed in. It was Karen. She was holding a flashlight wrapped with a piece of cloth to dim the beam. Every few seconds, she crouched, as if checking the ground for something. I watched silently as she made her way toward the back of the garage. She stood there for a long moment, her head tilted, as if she was looking at the camera. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something small and metallic. It looked like another key. I didn't move, I didn't call out. Instead, I pressed record and let the system do its job. She tried the key once, twice, then gave up. Her shoulders slumped, and she turned to leave. But as she walked away, she glanced back one last time, her face tight with frustration. The camera light blinked red, and for a second it reflected in her eyes like a warning. Then she disappeared into the darkness. I sat there in the glow of the monitor, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. Karen was trapped in her own need for control, and the harder she tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped away from her. The next morning would bring more whispers, more questions. And I had a feeling the whole neighborhood was about to see Karen in a way they never had before. By the next morning, the neighborhood was restless again. The air carried that quiet tension that spreads when everyone knows something, but no one dares to say it out loud. People were out early pretending to do yard work just so they could catch a glimpse of Karen's house. I poured a cup of coffee and stepped out to the porch. The lake shimmered under the morning light, but my eyes stayed fixed on her driveway. Her car was still there, but she hadn't stepped out yet. That was rare for someone who used to start her day with a list of who needed to trim their hedges. Around mid-morning, I saw movement behind her curtains. Karen appeared, pacing back and forth, phone in hand. Her face looked pale even from a distance, her hair slightly messy, like she hadn't slept much. Then Mark's car pulled up in front of her house. He got out quickly and hurried inside without knocking. The door shut behind him, and the blinds shifted again, as if someone was peeking out. I stayed still, watching quietly. Something about the way they were moving told me they were scared, not just nervous, but cornered. About an hour later, a black sedan turned into the street and parked near the curb. Two county officials stepped out wearing badges on their belts and clipboards in their hands. They walked straight to Karen's door and knocked firmly. I could almost hear the knock from where I stood. Karen opened the door slowly and tried to smile, but her voice carried no confidence this time. She motioned them inside while Mark stood stiffly beside her, his hands clasped in front of him. The officials stayed for a long time. Long enough for most of the neighbors to gather subtlety, pretending to be busy with their lawns, but watching every move. When the officials finally stepped back outside, their expressions were calm but serious. Karen followed them out, speaking fast, waving her hands as if she was trying to explain something. One of the officials stopped, turned to her, and said something short that made her freeze. Mark put his hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her down. But Karen brushed him off and stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind her. The officials glanced at each other, shook their heads, and left. As their car disappeared around the corner, the neighborhood seemed to exhale all at once. A few moments later, Mark came back outside alone. He looked exhausted. He walked past my driveway without saying a word. For the first time, there was no smug look, no polite smile, just quiet defeat. That night, I reviewed my camera footage again. Nothing unusual this time, just the calm reflection of the lake and the soft flicker of porch lights across the street. But as the hours passed, a light turned on inside Karen's house. Through the window, I could see her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of papers and folders. Her face was pale, her eyes red, as if she had been crying or reading something she didn't want to believe. I leaned back in my chair, watching the glow fade from her window. For years, Karen had built her power on fear and control. But now that power was slipping away piece by piece, and she didn't know how to stop it. I knew the storm wasn't over yet. People like Karen didn't vanish quietly. They tried to rebuild the pieces, even when everyone could see the cracks forming right in front of them. The next morning, the sun rose bright over the lake, and the air was cool and sharp. It felt like a fresh start, but the tension in the neighborhood still lingered. I could feel it in the silence that followed every car that passed by. People were waiting to see what Karen would do next. I walked to the end of the driveway and saw her mailbox stuffed with letters and envelopes. Some had bright red stickers labeled official notice. Others looked like complaints or warnings. It seemed the county investigation had started to dig deeper. Karen finally came out to collect her mail. She looked tired, her face drawn, and her eyes ringed with shadows. Gone was the woman who used to march around the neighborhood with her clipboard and a smirk. Now she moved slower, her shoulders hunched as she flipped through the letters. Mark's car wasn't in her driveway anymore. Word around the block was that he had resigned from the HOA board quietly a few days before. No meeting, no announcement, just gone. Even he had realized that Karen's ship was sinking. She stood there for a long moment staring at one of the envelopes. Then she looked up and saw me watching from across the street. For the first time, she didn't glare or scold. She just looked at me with something that almost resembled regret. I gave a small nod, but said nothing. She turned and walked back toward her house, clutching the mail to her chest. Later that afternoon, a county vehicle pulled up again. A woman stepped out, this time wearing a blazer and carrying a folder. She knocked on Karen's door, and they talked for a long while on the porch. I couldn't hear what was said, but Karen's expression shifted from defiant to defeated as the conversation went on. The woman finally handed her a paper and walked back to her car. Karen stood frozen on the porch, staring down at it before going back inside. As night fell, the lights in her house stayed off. No shadows moved behind the curtains, no sound of her voice carrying down the street. It was strange, almost eerie, to see her house so still. I sat outside listening to the crickets and the soft rustle of the trees. The air felt different, lighter somehow. It was the first evening in months without Karen's presence pressing over the neighborhood. But deep down I knew it wasn't over. Karen didn't know how to give up completely. There was always one last card she liked to play, one last attempt to regain control. And judging by the way she had looked at that last envelope, I knew she was already thinking about her next move. The following day, the sky was covered in thick gray clouds that hung low over the lake. A soft wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of rain and wet leaves. The neighborhood was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way it used to be. It was the kind of quiet that meant people were waiting for something to happen. Karen's house remained dark through most of the morning. Then around noon, the front door opened, and she stepped out wearing a long coat and dark glasses. She held a folder tight against her chest and walked straight to her car, without looking at anyone. I watched from the porch as she drove away, her tires crunching on the gravel. Something about the way she moved told me she wasn't done yet. She had that same tense determination that showed up whenever she felt cornered. About an hour later, I got a message from one of the neighbors. It was a photo of Karen standing outside the HOA office downtown talking to a man in a suit. The caption said she was filing an appeal. I wasn't surprised. Karen always needed the last word. By evening, she returned home. She didn't glance at anyone's house this time. She went straight inside and closed the blinds tight. But not long after, her lights came back on, and I saw her moving around in her office. Stacks of papers covered her desk, and the faint glow of her laptop lit up her face. I leaned back in my chair, watching through my window. It was clear she was building something again. Maybe another complaint, maybe a new plan to regain her position in the HOA. The wind picked up outside, and the rain started falling softly against the roofs. Through the steady sound of it, I could hear faint noises from her house. The clicking of her keyboard, the squeak of a chair moving back and forth. It went on for hours. Even after midnight, her lights were still on. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the lake shimmered under a pale light. When I went outside, I saw something new. A folded letter placed neatly under the wiper of my truck. It was from Karen. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, the same as always. She wrote that she wanted to talk, that she believed there had been misunderstandings, and that things had gotten out of hand. Her tone was calm, too calm, almost rehearsed. I read the letter twice and looked up toward her house. Her blinds were still closed, but I could feel her watching, waiting to see what I would do next. The air felt heavy again, not with anger this time, but with something quieter, something uncertain. Karen had always thrived on control. But now she was reaching out, and that meant something inside her was beginning to crack. I held the letter in my hand for a long time, reading each word slowly. Karen's tone was careful, almost polite, but there was something hidden between the lines. It wasn't an apology, not really, it was a test. She wanted to see if I would respond, if I would give her the smallest chance to step back into control. I placed the letter on the table and stared out at the lake. The reflection of the clouds drifted across the water, just like thoughts drifting through my mind. Part of me wondered if talking to her would end this constant tension once and for all. But another part of me knew that opening that door might start the whole cycle again. For the rest of the morning, I kept myself busy cleaning the yard, trimming the fence, and checking the cameras. Every time I looked toward her house, I saw a flicker of movement behind the curtain. Karen was watching, waiting for a reaction. By late afternoon, I decided to walk over. The moment she saw me approaching her front steps, the curtain shifted, and the door opened a crack. Karen stood there still, wearing the same dark glasses, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. "You got my letter," she said, her voice quieter than usual. I nodded slowly, and said I did. She hesitated before speaking again. "I think things have gone too far," she said. "The HOA, the inspectors, the neighbors, I just wanted things to stay organized. I didn't mean for all of this to happen." Her words came out carefully measured, like she was trying not to reveal too much. I could tell she had practiced them in her head before opening the door. Karen, I said calmly, "You crossed a line when you tried to enter my garage. You know that, and so does everyone else." She looked away for a moment, her jaw tightening. Then she sighed and said, "I was just trying to make sure everything was up to code." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she seemed to realize how weak that sounded. The silence stretched between us, carried only by the soft wind from the lake. For the first time, I saw her differently, not as the loud, demanding woman who ruled the neighborhood, but as someone who had built her whole identity around control and was now standing in the ruins of it. She rubbed her arm nervously and said, "Maybe I went too far, maybe I should step back for a while." That was the first true thing I had heard her say in months. I nodded slowly and replied, "That would be a good idea, Karen." She gave a small nod in return and stepped back into the doorway. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it. But as I turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You know they're not done with me," she said. "The county, the board, they're still digging through everything. They'll find things that could make this worse." I paused but didn't turn around. Then I heard the door close quietly behind me. The sky had started to turn orange over the lake, and the air smelled of wet earth. It felt like a chapter closing, but something about her last words stayed in my mind. Whatever the county was about to uncover, it sounded like Karen wasn't the only one involved. That evening, the sky dimmed to a soft gold as the sun sank behind the lake. The water shimmered in the fading light, calm and unbroken. I sat on the porch listening to the quiet hum of crickets and the soft creak of the wooden boards beneath my chair. For the first time in months, there was no tension in the air. No clipboard tapping on the pavement, no voice shouting about rules or violations. Just silence and peace. The next morning, a county vehicle returned to the neighborhood. Two officials stepped out and walked directly to Karen's house. The neighbors watched from their windows as they handed her a thick envelope and spoke for a few minutes before driving away. Karen stood on her porch holding the papers, her shoulders slumped. She looked around the street, her gaze sweeping across the homes she once ruled over. Then her eyes met mine for the last time. There was no anger in them, no arrogance, only exhaustion and something close to acceptance. The following week, a moving truck arrived early in the morning. Karen loaded a few boxes herself, while two movers carried the rest. No one approached her, no one offered help or asked questions. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. When the truck pulled away, the street felt lighter. It was as if a long-held breath had finally been released. A new family moved into her house a month later. Friendly people who waved at everyone and kept to themselves. The HOA board was restructured, and the new members focused on keeping the neighborhood peaceful. One evening, as I watched the sunset reflect across the lake, I thought about how it all began. One woman with too much power, too much pride, and not enough restraint. In the end, it wasn't anyone else who brought her down. It was her own need for control that finally took everything away. The camera light blinked softly above the garage door, catching the fading glow of the sky. The house was quiet, the air was still, and for the first time since I had moved there, it finally felt like home.